What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so under normal circumstances, I would not refer to this as a Dark Knight's Metal tie-in, but it is. And the reason why I say that is for those of you guys who are new to comic books, who are just getting into Marvel, who are just getting into DC, you usually have major crossover events, and then you have tie-ins for those events. Now, what DC is doing with Dark Knight's Metal is actually somewhat new when it comes to DC. For the most part, whenever DC does like events, they're usually character-driven events. The Batman family, the Superman family, but you don't usually see crossover events that are line wide, which is to say Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, the Justice League, Green Lantern, the Flash, they all cross over into this huge story. They do it occasionally, but not very often. Marvel does that all the time, which is one of the reasons why people are kind of getting burned out on event fatigue, because there's just so many huge events where so many things are happening. What DC's doing with Dark Knight's Metal is they're basically telling this cohesive story, and then they're offering one-shot tie-ins. But what this does is it actually offers some explanation of what's going on with the Bruce Wayne character in terms of nth metal and his pursuit of what nth metal is. And we'll talk about that once we cross the bridge or the part of the story that really brings in the element of a tie-in. But the other half of what this story does is it offers all kinds of insight into the character of Azrael to John Paul Valley. Now, the cool thing about this is that I guess it's really Jean Paul Valley, but with his character, he's really kind of a relic of the pre-New 52 era, which is to say he first popped up in the 1990s. Now, the idea was that he served his purpose, and as we get through this, we'll talk about that. He was really one of these characters where once his role was played, DC was trying to find a way to keep him relevant, to keep him interesting. The problem was that they really couldn't. He had formed a niche fan base, but outside of that small fan base, no one really cared what happened with his character. Now, he's had appearances in different forms of medium, in the Arkham games, where he's really one of the coolest characters, but outside of like hardcore fans, people who really who read Batman or read comics consistently, most people have long since forgotten who Azrael is. Now, what this does is it just kind of picks up at a basketball game, and we're immediately met with the arrival of a character named Nomos. Now, one thing I want you to notice here is that this scenario does not immediately include Batman. Instead, it actually picks up with Batwoman, with Lucas Fox, and with Azrael. Now, that's the nature of Detective Comics. I've seen a few questions about this in the comment section of my videos, which is one of the reasons why I want to hit on this. When it comes to Superman and Batman, you basically have two different titles running for each character. For Batman, you have the Batman solo series, and then you have Detective Comics. For Superman, you have the Superman solo series, and then Action Comics. The Superman solo series is designed for the most part to focus almost exclusively on Superman. It'll feature some supporting characters, but for the most part, it just focuses on him. With regards to the Action Comics line, that's when you get a lot of the supporting characters, a lot of the other characters out there outside of Lois Lane and Superman's son, Jonathan Kent. With Batman, it's much the same way. The Batman comics focus almost exclusively on Bruce Wayne. And then on the other side, you have Detective Comics. The idea is that with DC Rebirth, what they're doing is actually telling two separate stories. Detective Comics tells one story, Batman tells another. Action Comics tells one story, Superman tells another. So I just wanted to go ahead and offer that explanation out there for people who were a little bit curious about, how the stories relate to one another. But this story focuses basically on the Bat family. That's really all Detective Comics does. It just tells a wholly separate story from what the Batman solo series focuses on. But what we end up doing here is with the arrival of Nomos, this basically begins the process of hitting all the way back to the, Batman Sword of Azrael origin story back in 1992. Well, not really an origin story so much as like his first appearance in DC. His origin was actually came out of Azrael Annual number 1 in 1994, 95, I think it was. It was after Batman Nightfall. But initially, we just kind of pick up with Bruce Wayne. Now, Bruce Wayne's on the hunt for a person in particular. We don't know who this person is, but with Nomos having effectively collapsed, in the presence of Azrael and Batwoman and Lucas Fox, he's basically whisked away to the Belfry, which is currently the location of where the Bat family hangs out at, where they train, practice, different things like that. But what this begins to do is it begins to answer the question regarding the origin of Azrael. Now, the idea here is that DC's drawing on two things. They're drawing on Batman's Sword of Azrael, and they're drawing on Azrael Annual number 1. Now, the reason why this is important is because Jean Paul Valley got somewhat of a reboot with the New 52. And while it wasn't the most well received, because DC Rebirth serves the purpose of basically grabbing old stories and old characters and old plot lines and origins that fans find familiar and rolling it into the new generation, reason, it makes perfect sense to go all the way back to the origin story of John Paul Valley, how he existed back in the 1990s, and make that part of the equation. And so this falls directly in line with Batman Sword of Azrael and Azrael Annual number 1. What we know is that he is basically an engineered guy. He was trained by a group called the Order of Saint Dumas. Now, my knowledge on the original Azrael, or at least the original origin of Azrael, is a little hazy just because of the fact that it's been so long, but the long and short of it is that with his origin story, the mantle of Azrael is actually a title that's given to people. And the reason why is because Azrael is one of the angels. But the idea here was that with the role of the Order of Saint Dumas, they were a splinter group from the Knights Templar, the religious sect that existed for years and years and years and years. The idea was that the Order of Saint Dumas breaking off and forming their own splinter cell, they basically rolled in all these Judeo-Christian themes. And the idea was that they functioned for the purpose of gathering wealth, of, dominating the world, of all these different schemes that you would expect from traditional villains. Now, as time progressed, they were basically evolved a little bit more, but the idea is that all their assassins function, or really their main assassin functions, as the means by which they look to achieve almost all their goals. If there's a politician that stands in their way, they send their assassin, Azrael, to take them out. Now, the way this happens is that with Jean Paul Valley, he was engineered and then he was just kind of sent out there. And the goal was that his father basically freed him, and his father, tried to help him live a normal life. Eventually, his dad was killed. Jean Paul Valley was brought back in, and then he was basically raised and then allowed to go back out into the world again. And the reason for that is because of the fact that with the Order of Saint Dumas breaking off from the Knights Templar, the order themselves had a rift within their own group. There were those individuals who said, we follow these religious teachings. There were others who said, you're not going far enough. And the ones who said, you're not going far enough, are effectively the ones who won out. They basically went through and started killing all these members of the Order of Saint Dumas that were basically not acting extreme enough. And so the result is that with the character of Jean Paul Valley, he was released out into the world for the purpose of gaining his own life, of, forming a life for himself, probably even starting a family. And then he would be brought back in, and then he would be forced to be conditioned. They would basically break him down on the most basic psychological level in every conceivable way. And once he was broken, he would simply cease being a man. He would just be a vessel for what was called the programming, or at least, the program, or, the system, or whatever you want to call it. Basically, this programming that existed within him that would be activated and that would serve to just be the one force that drove him to do everything that he did. He would basically just carry out the whims and wants of the extremists of the Order of Saint Dumas, and that would be it. Now, the other half of this is that we end up finding out that there is basically this being running around called Ascalon. And Ascalon is essentially, or at least as he's depicted, everything that Jean Paul Valley was supposed to be. And again, we'll get a little more into that origin story as we continue through this. But switching back to Bruce Wayne, what basically happens here is that with the whole, concept of him going to see somebody, of course, Ascalon shows up to basically find a guy named Brother Kodo. Now, of course, Brother Kodo is the last of these members of the Order of Saint Dumas that was not deemed to be extreme enough. All of his other members are basically dead. They've all been killed off. The idea is that Ascalon was the one that did it. And so with Ascalon showing up here on the scene, the goal is to take out Brother Kodo. Now, of course, this coincides with the arrival of the person that Bruce Wayne was trying to meet, which is Zatanna. Now, Zatanna is such a cool character when it comes to DC Comics, and she's one of my absolute favorites. In truth, she's largely tied to like John Constantine, to the demons, angels, sorcery, witchcraft, magic kind of element of DC, which you usually find in Vertigo. But I would say probably the coolest thing about Zatanna is that when she casts spells, she speaks backwards. And that's what's so cool about that, is because literally, like, whenever you go through her stories or you read a comic that has her story in it or has her in it, it's as much a game to decipher what it is that she's saying as it is to learn about the plot of the story and what it is that's unfolding. And you guys will see what I'm talking about as we begin to go through this. But what this story also does is it really goes back to the early days of Bruce Wayne, and it focuses largely on the idea that him and Zatanna had not necessarily been a romantic couple so much as they had feelings for one another that they never really acted on. But the idea was that Zatanna basically served as this vector by which Bruce Wayne could learn about the various things that exist out there in the world that he wasn't aware of before. Because remember, if you're new to DC and you're going around and you're reading DC Comics, in a lot of ways you're like Bruce Wayne, or at least Bruce Wayne when he was younger. There's superheroes, there's Superman, there's Wonder Woman, there's the Green Lantern, there's Batman, just all these things that are new to you, but you only see DC through the lens of superheroes. It's not until you crack open a Vertigo book that you learn about God and the devil, and you learn about the angels that stand between the two of them, the darker stories of Green Arrow. You start learning about all these really dark elements of characters. You're basically waking up to a new world. And that's exactly what Zatanna was doing with Bruce Wayne when he was younger. Now again, going back to the moment here, back to the present day, of course, speaking backwards, she's basically able to increase the gravity on Ascalon, and that's really about it. They kind of, make their escape, bail out while they can, along with the rest of the members of the Bat family. And so what ends up happening here is that we switch back over, of course, again, to the Belfry and so on. But one of the sad things about this, and this is one of the most notable things, is that they bring a doctor in for the purpose of basically analyzing Nomos and trying to figure out, what's going on with him from his injuries and so on. But the question is also asked of Clayface, is your interest in me because of the fact that you're trying to find a way to revert yourself back to normal? Now again, when it comes to Clayface, he's basically a good guy now. But we as readers know that because he was always a bad guy with regards to the Bat family, the time will come when he will eventually turn back to being a villain. But the idea is that, again, the whole question has to be asked, what is this Ascalon character? How does it tie into Jean-Paul Valley, into Azrael? What in the world is going on here? Now again, this is kind of the cool thing, because what this does is it basically focuses on the nature of Jean-Paul himself coming to terms with the fact that his past is coming back to haunt him. This is when we get into the origin aspect, or really kind of the expanded origin aspect of Jean-Paul. So the way his character worked, because of the fact that he was initially introduced as a guy who could potentially be a Batman villain, because Nightfall served the purpose of basically trying to find a way to remove Bruce Wayne as Batman and replace him with somebody else, in the same way that the Clone Saga for Spider-Man sought to remove Peter Parker and replace him with Ben Reilly. The goal was to basically bring in someone new. And so Azrael, Jean-Paul Valley, was introduced as a guy who was effectively a religious zealot. Now the goal was, because of the fact that he had been conditioned to be a religious zealot, eventually working alongside Batman and Alfred, he eventually cast his zealotry aside and basically became a good guy. Now this led directly into Batman Nightfall, so that when Bane broke the back of Bruce Wayne, Azrael took up the mantle and became Batman in his place. Now following the events of Nightfall, DC never really knew what to do with him. There was really nothing to do with his character. He had served his role, served his purpose. They bounced him around here and there. Different writers tried to make him intriguing, but for the most part, he fell into the role of a background character. And the result is that where, again, he had his niche of fans, when it came to the general population, people who just went out, bought comics for a little while, wanted to read about what was happening, and then eventually stopped, Jean-Paul Valley kind of became this thing of the past. Now, the other half of this is that Batman begins to basically talk to Zatanna about an orb, about a means by which he can basically go through and begin gaining answers to questions that he doesn't know the answers to. Now, the look and the shock from Zatanna is that Bruce Wayne's beginning to remember something he shouldn't remember. And the implication here is that she wiped his mind to keep him from remembering something. The fact that Bruce Wayne wants to learn about, like, what happened to the fate of Tim Drake. Is Tim Drake really alive, or is Tim Drake dead? Because in the mind of Batman, Tim Drake is dead, but there are aspects of him and there are questions that are being asked. Is Tim Drake actually alive? And so ultimately what we end up learning is that because of the fact that Jean-Paul Valley was attacked by, Ascalon, ultimately his reconditioning or his programming is reactivated. And what this means is it sends Jean-Paul Valley all the way back to where he was before, when he originally popped up on the landscape in DC. And that's extremely important to remember, because what this is going to do is serve the purpose of basically restoring Azrael to the DC landscape as really a mainstream character, more or less, or at least that seems to be the case. And at the same time, rework him to make him more interesting. And so what this does is it switches back to the past again. It jumps back to the younger days of Batman and Zatanna. What ends up happening is Zatanna basically begins the process of talking to him about different things that exist out there, different forms of magic, and this discussion coincides with what's going on in the present day. And so instead of bouncing back and forth here and there between the past and the present and making things confusing, what we'll say is this: for the character of Bruce Wayne, whether it's him experiencing it right now with regards to his discussions with Zatanna, whether it's him experiencing it in the past in his discussions with Zatanna when they were both teenagers, the idea is that Bruce Wayne has largely remained hidden from the world that is full of all kinds of magics and things. And what this is designed to do is basically illustrate how ill-equipped Batman would be against these things, how advanced and how extreme these things are. When it comes to the character of Zatanna, it's one part sleight of hand and one part legitimate magic and sorcery. And that's what makes her so cool, is because when she's casting spells, make it daytime in the middle of the night. When she's casting spells, we're gonna go fly. When she's casting spells and she says turn rain into flowers, it's basically her invoking legitimate magic, invoking these elements of this world that Bruce Wayne isn't necessarily a part of. And that's the point that she basically makes here. When she was younger, I guess, in this circumstance, she basically shows him this orb that will give him all the answers to the questions that he wants to have. Now, what we find out is that in the past, she had also showed him the orb. She had also showed him this Genosis orb. I'm not sure exactly how you pronounce it, but she shows him this sphere that if he holds it, it'll give him the answers to every question that he ever has. The problem with this is that the questions are unending. The first person to have ever picked it up and held it with their hand had this unending stream of questions, and they just held the orb getting all these answers until they died of starvation and hunger, because all they wanted were answers to questions. They were just totally obsessed. For Batman, he's much in the same boat, and that's exactly what Zatanna says. It's not like you're picking up the orb and you're saying, what are the winning lottery numbers tomorrow? Batman has all kinds of questions. Give me answers about the Lazarus pits, the nth metal, Tim Drake. Give me answers about all these things. And that's what Zatanna says. Her problem, what she basically says is, look, this is not the first time that you've come to me seeking this orb, trying to get answers to the nth metal. It's the 5th time, and I've wiped your mind every single time it's happened. Basically, this whole tie-in, this whole idea of Batman searching out nth metal, the answer is right there. That's the whole basis with Dark Knight's metal. Dark Knight's metal is this question: what is nth metal? What's this metal that exists out there that has basically been ingested by various superheroes through drinking water and all kinds of things that have allowed them to become superheroes in the first place? These are all the things that Bruce Wayne wants to know the answers to. He's gotten these answers 5 times, and each time he's gotten these answers, he hasn't been able to handle it. He basically began to go insane, and Zatanna wiped his mind so that he wouldn't have to worry about that anymore. That's why this is so crazy, because what this tells us is the forces that we're going to be dealing with in Dark Knight's metal are going to be extreme. It's going to be absolutely crazy, because the question is, where does it end up leading to? And so again, what it does from here is it begins to just kind of switch back over to the main story itself, which is to say the whole idea of Jean Paul Valley basically being forced back into the system, or at least being forced back into his programming, and then taking on the entirety of the Bat family. Now, the other reason why this matters, and the other reasons why this is so significant, is because of the fact that Jean Paul Valley as Azrael is being depicted to us here as someone not to be trifled with. And this really hits all the way back to his original origin. When he first popped up on the scene, because of the various enhancement that he had, because of the fighting expertise that he had, because of what he was capable of, he was, in every sense of the word, a one-man army. And in this instance here, it would be nothing for him to take out the entirety of the Bat family. It would be the easiest thing in the world to do. The other half of this is that this Ascalon robot is basically trying to figure out, or trying to get answers to questions. And so what it's basically done is gone through and has hijacked all these, Batman robots that belong to Lucas Fox, the son of Lucius Fox, and is basically using them to survey the entire city. Now remember, these members of the Order of Saint Dumas are driven by a religious zealotry. They look at murder, they look at crime, they look at, these archaic 1950s, even 1800 ideologies. They look at them as being sinful, as opposed to stepping in the modern day and saying, that's just the way the world is now. They look at this and saying, these people are living in sin, quite literally. And the goal of this robot is to basically eliminate every single last one of these. Now, in terms of Jean Paul Valley, try as they might, they cannot pull it off. He's just that capable. And that's the important thing about this with this character. It's designed to show us how dangerous he is when he's operating at the absolute max. And the reason for that is because if people are new to DC Rebirth and they're reading through Detective Comics and they've seen these small appearances of Jean Paul Valley, for the most part, he seems like an obscure character who's totally irrelevant and can't do anything. He can do quite a few things. He can really take on the entirety of the Bat family by himself. Now, given enough time, he would be completely overwhelmed, and that's what happens here. He's basically defeated by Cassandra, and that's really the end of that. He's just kind of taken down by one of the members of the Bat family, knocked unconscious, and that's really the end of him for the moment. But the goal is to figure out what to do next. The goal is to figure out what to do with Jean Paul Valley, and this is where the wholesale rework of his character comes into play. And that's the cool thing about this is this hits home at the very nature of DC Rebirth. DC Rebirth is not a reboot. It was never designed to be a reboot. The idea with DC Rebirth is to say, okay, so you guys didn't like everything that we did. All right, there are classic roles that characters played, characters like the classic Wally West that you want to see come back. We're going to take those characters that you guys love from the New 52, the way they're rebooted, the way they're reimagined, we're going to leave them that way. The characters that you don't like, we're going to take them back to their classic roots. And that's exactly what happens with Jean Paul Valley. But the way this works is to take the character that we know, to reinvigorate him, but keep its classic roots intact. And so what it does is it basically sees the creation of a new Batman suit. And this Batman suit functions according to an artificial artificial intelligence that was basically designed for the purpose of operating outside of the control of the Order of Saint Dumas, which is to say, it can basically replace the programming that's already in Jean-Paul Valley. And Jean-Paul Valley is thrown inside this suit, and then this inner battle basically begins to take place, where the artificial intelligence of the suit basically merges with Jean-Paul Valley's mind, and so it's this new artificial intelligence versus the evil artificial intelligence. And the result is that it leads to basically Jean-Paul Valley emerging and becoming what looks like a very similar iteration of his character when he existed as Batman. Because of that, Jean-Paul Valley able to overcome this system, this programming in his body, and basically turn himself full on over to this new AI as it's been provided to him, basically reworks his character. What it does is it says, okay, this character of Azrael, his original origin from Azrael Annual #1, from the Sword of Azrael, that's all still intact. That's all still the same. This is just the next step in his character's evolution. And that's the cool thing here, is because now he's being reworked, he's being refunctioned. Now, of course, with the character of Zatanna and with this Ascalon robot, of course, the question comes into play. If it has nothing but questions, and if all it wants to do is learn, then Zatanna just kind of pops up and says, here, take this orb and get answers to the questions that you're looking for. Now, the goal is to basically drive this robot to the point that it becomes insane. But what ends up happening is the robot itself basically manifests in two different ways. The artificial intelligence of the robot manifests as a physical child, and then the robot itself just kind of functions out there as its own artificial intelligence. But the idea is that the biggest flaw this robot had in terms of trying to function, trying to basically implement its goal of purging sin from the city of Gotham, is that it was looking at the world through the eyes of a child. It was saying, here's how I would like the world to be. Because I would like the world to be this way, the world is that way. That's not the way it is. There's how this child wanted the world to be, then there's how the way the world is. And the child was completely unable to reconcile those two things. And that was the biggest problem with this robot. But the biggest information piece that this robot drops is directly to Bruce Wayne. And what it simply tells Bruce Wayne is that Tim Drake is alive. And that's huge because remember, as far as Bruce Wayne knows, Tim Drake is dead. That happened all the way back in the very first volume of Detective Comics. You ended up having the father of Batwoman show up in Gotham City for the purpose of taking all the technology of Batman, using it for their own ends in an effort to basically defeat some enemy we didn't know at the time, but actually turned out to be the League of Shadows. And what ended up happening here is that in this onslaught, Tim Drake made it possible for the Bat family to escape dying, but seemingly sacrificed himself in the process. What ended up happening is that in truth, Tim Drake was whisked away by Mr. Oz, this mysterious individual who's somehow tied into the Watchmen, or at least we believe he's tied into the Watchmen. All roads lead to the Watchmen when it comes to DC Rebirth. In some form or fashion, every story ties into the Watchmen in some way, whether it's through Mr. Oz or even references to Dr. Manhattan. But what this does is it sets the stage for the hunt for Tim Drake to try to figure out how to get him back, which inevitably will probably bring him face to face with Mr. Oz himself and whoever it is Mr. Oz has captured, which could be anybody that we haven't seen yet. Fingers crossed, Superboy Prime. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna go ahead and bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.